Government spending is like bankrupting the country. We have to cut government spending or we're just going to go bankrupt, just like person would.
Elon Musk might not have been educated on when he did his economics degree because economic textbooks do not teach this model. They teach another model where there's no relationship between debt and money. If the government is going into negative equity, that's creating positive equity for the private sector. It's not a burden, it's a bonus. There's someone that Elon Musk desperately needs to speak to give him proper guidance about reducing the government deficit, and that person is Elon Musk. Let's have a listen to about what his objectives are with Doge.
If you had to put a number on it, how much do you think you've identified waste, fraud, abuse, corruption at this point?
The overall goal is to try to get $1 trillion out of the deficit. If the deficit is not brought under control, America will go bankrupt. This is a very important thing for people to understand. A country is no different from an individual in that if an individual overspends, an individual can go bankrupt, and so can a country.
So, by analogy, if an individual can go bankrupt, then so can a country. Now, there's a certain Elon Musk who said that wasn't a good idea to reason by analogy. Let's have a listen to him.
I think it's also important to reason from first principles rather than by analogy. First principles is a physics way of looking at the world. And what that really means is you boil things down to the most fundamental truths and say, okay, what are we sure is true or as sure as possible is true? And then reason up from there.
So, the real way to do it, what we should be doing is reasoning from first principles. Now, in first principles of physics, you have things like the laws of thermodynamics, the rocket equation for the part of his activities that I'm most in favor of. Now, the first principles he's dealing with here are not details of first principles of physics. They're the first principles of money. And to understand money, the first principles start from double entry bookkeeping. Let's just take a look at the analogy that Musk made in that video about how governments being just like households and firms having to borrow money, and therefore, if they spend more than they earn all the time, they're going to end up in a crisis. And I'm going to show that in a program that I invented and I've designed with a colleague, Russell Standish, called Ravel. And it's the only program that I'm aware of on the planet that lets you actually look at the financial system through the lens of double entry bookkeeping. So what I've done here is take the analogy that Musk was working with in that discussion with Sean Hannity, that the government's just like households and firms. Households and firms both borrow from banks. So what I'm now showing is households and firms and the government all borrow from banks. So you borrow money, a banking system puts borrow dollars per year into your bank account, and it records you owe it borrow dollars per year in each of the respective loan accounts. That's loan accounts for firms, for households, for government. That's the deposit accounts for firms, households, and government. And then for a very simple little model to illustrate what might be wrong with Musk's reasoning there, if Musk would listen to Musk on this issue. Firms pay interest, that goes to the banks. Households pay interest, the government pays interest, and then you have the fundamental activities of a market economy. The firms have to hire workers to get production done, so wages go from firms to households, and then households consume the output of firms. Banks are spending just on firms. This is just for simplicity. Firms also spend money hiring workers and so on, but I'm just going to, if I included that a complication, it would make no difference to the outcome I'm trying to show here. And then the banks spend buying output from firms, and the government taxes, and the government spends. So that's the basic double entry bookkeeping logic. And then to make a simple model here, what I have is firms turning over their money at a certain rate. This is called the time constant for those who know their engineering ideas. So firms have about $1 million or $1 billion in their bank accounts. Over a 2-year period, they turn that over completely. So for wages, starting from 700, they would spend 350 per year on wages. Households consume much more rapidly because they have smaller bank accounts. If you're a wage worker, then your bank balance might be $2,000 in the beginning of the month, and you might spend $50,000 over a year. So that money turns over many times. So it might last you 1 or 2 months with no income coming in. You'd be able to consume at that rate $100 million or $1 billion in the account. You can see in 500 per year. Banks, and I'm lumping banks with bankers, capitalists with firms, workers with households here. So banks are much wealthier. Bankers are much wealthier, have a larger amount of money, but they spend it very slowly. It might take them 5 years to exhaust their account with $100 billion in it. So each year they're going to spend $20 billion. That's the sort of logic there. Then you add up, but then of course you've got to pay debt on your interest on your debt rather. So you have loans by firms, households and government, a fixed interest rate. I don't need to include a variable to show the effects I'm talking about here. On the interest, the wonderful idea that the best part is no part, the best equation is no equation. So I'm just looking at a constant rate of interest here. So firms pay interest, households pay interest, government pays interest. That becomes interest income to the bankers. And then you have these all being added together as consumption items. So that's private sector spending. And then you add in the deficit, because the way GDP is defined is to include exports minus imports and government spending minus taxation as part of GDP. So I'm leaving out the foreign trade bit, but you then have wages plus consumption plus spending by banks plus interest paid to banks plus the deficit is total GDP. And then with total GDP, I then have the households and firms deciding to borrow a certain amount of money that's equivalent to a fraction of GDP each year. At the moment, it's saying banks would borrow equivalent to 5% of GDP per year. So they're going to borrow $44 billion. Households borrow a small amount. They're going to borrow $17, $18 billion. And then I've got the government. I'm just going to set the government down to 0 here. So the government not running a deficit, its spending is equal to taxation. I've got the same fraction of GDP of spending for the taxation system. So there's no borrowing going on. And I can vary that and check about the possibility that, say, the government running a deficit of 3% of GDP each year. That's what the simulation software here is designed to do. And then we look at the consequences of that in terms of the growth rate for GDP and the level of net worth, and that's important. I'll come back to that in quite a bit of detail later in the video. And this is working out the net worth of each of these sectors. So the household's net worth is the gap between what they've got in the deposit accounts and what they owe the banks. Same for firms, same for the government as well. So let's just simulate this and see what happens. And I'm just going to come down here and focus on GDP. And we've got, in this case, I've got borrowing by the firms and borrowing by households, but no borrowing by the government. So let's just run that. And you get a growing GDP over time, growing debt levels, also a growing amount of money. And this is one thing which Elon Musk might not have been educated on when he did his economics degree, because economic textbooks do not teach this model. They teach another model where there's no relationship between debt and money. And I think that's what's in Musk's head, though he's not necessarily aware of that, because to be aware of it, you've got to do the double entry bookkeeping. But here what we've got going is the debt levels start to stabilize ultimately. So we're getting a level of firm debt reaching 100% of GDP, households reaching about 40%. I'm going to run this for 100 years in terms of simulation time. You can see the simulation time up here. Yeah, I have a T down here. So 68 years, et cetera, watching the numbers all roll out. So ultimately, the level of debt of firms is stabilizing at about 110% of GDP, household debt at about 45% of GDP. So they can sustain that. Now, what about the government? And the basic argument coming out of Musk and most media commentators, most journalists, certainly most economists, is that because the government borrows money to cover its interest payments, it's going to have this simply can't work for governments. They're going to have a crisis. So what's happening with the government finances is shown down by this set of equations here. And this is pretty much covering what is actually required by governments all around the world. So if government spending exceeds taxation, let's now make it, say, 3% of GDP. So the deficit is 3% of GDP. Then spending, let's just do a recalculation. Spending exceeds taxation. That means there's a deficit. And the government is required to sell bonds, which is what is known as government borrowing, sell bonds equivalent to the deficit plus interest payments on existing bonds. And that's what's seen as causing an inevitable crisis, because each year the interest payment is going to continue rising and you're going to have a crisis. So let's just now go back and rerun the simulation. And what we're expecting is to see the debt level for the government explode and the interest payments as a percentage of GDP also explode. Off we go, and government debt starts off above household debt but below firm debt as a percentage of GDP. Then it starts to overtake it. Hey, this is where the problem could be that Musk is worried about, saying it's not an option. We've got to reduce government spending, get rid of the deficit to avoid a crisis. Now we have our government debt exceeding debt for the firm sector. And the debt for the firm sector, by the way, is substantially lower than the previous simulation. Ditto for household debt. Supposed to be going vertical. This is supposed to be rising. What's going on? Let's run it for the full time periods. I'm up to 56, 60 years so far in the notional simulation. And what's happening is the amount of money, as in the previous simulation, is rising, because when you borrow money from a bank, the bank creates money at the same time. You get the money, the bank gets the increase in debt, and that's why they lent the money to you in the first place. And rather than getting a crisis, we get a substantial level of government debt, about 70% of GDP, interest payments running at about 3.5% of GDP with a 5% rate of interest, but there's no crisis. So what's gone wrong with the analogy? The analogy didn't include the fact when you borrow money from a bank, that creates money. Okay? When the bank lends, it puts credit dollars per year into your account as money you actually get to spend, and it puts credit dollars per year as extra debt you've got to pay at the same time. So this is what's missing from the analogy. An analogy doesn't tell you what the first principles are. And when you don't understand the first principles of money, or that's not part of your thinking, you don't realize that borrowing over here, which is creating debt on this side of the ledger, is creating money on this side. So there isn't a crisis coming out of the situation. Let's be more extreme. Let's just try another simulation where I have no borrowing by the firm sector and no borrowing by the household sector, and the government's running a 6% of GDP deficit, which is pretty much what's happening at the moment in the American economy. Let's run that simulation and see, surely that's going to cause a crisis. And you see there's zero debt for the households and firms in the simulation, but rising debt for the government. Interest payments are exceeding 4% of GDP already, and government debt's 100% of GDP, so this is looking dire. We're in the territory we're currently in now. And the forecast, the projections from the Congressional Budget Office and from most economists is this is going to compound and grow indefinitely. But this is a simple but full model of a financial system, looking at all the feedbacks that exist. So when you borrow money from a bank, you create money at the same time. That feedback is left out of the conventional thinking. It's not taught in economic textbooks. It's certainly not practiced by a macroeconomist when they build macroeconomic models, because this might be a surprise to you if you're not an economist. But the vast majority of economic models, mainstream economic models, do not include the banking sector. They don't include money, and they don't include debt. So they make forecasts of what's going to happen to debt based on the effectively barter logic that's built into those models, but they don't actually look at the system itself. I've now run this for 100 years, and interest payments are higher than beforehand, but they settled in at 7% of GDP. They didn't go exponential. The government debt level stabilised at 140% of GDP. And this is a world in which firms and households are doing no borrowing at all, only the government. Now, what's the net outcome for society in these different cases? And I'm not making a case for the conclusion here. I'm just showing what the conclusion is. So what's going on with these amounts here? I'm working out what the net worth is of each of the entities in the society. So you have the net worth of the household sector ends up being 139 by 10 to the 3. So that's 138,577, having started from 100 initially. So households have got a positive net worth. Banks have a positive net worth. Notice that the net worth of the private sector, which is positive 3.63776 times e to the 10 to the 6, is precisely equal to the negative entry of the government. So rather than the government debt being a burden for the private sector, which is the way it's taught in textbooks and the type of thinking behind the desire to eliminate the deficit, the negative for the government becomes a positive for the private sector. This is one of the outcomes of looking at this in the economy in double entry bookkeeping terms, because any financial asset for you is a financial liability for somebody else. The sum of all financial assets and liabilities is zero. So if the government is going to negative equity, which is what's happening in this model, that's creating positive equity for the private sector. It's not a burden, it's a bonus. And this is the error of thinking just in analogy terms, and the analogy doesn't include the first principles, so you get the whole damn thing wrong. Now, I am fairly confident that Elon Musk would not have tried to get rockets into outer space by working on analogy, what happens when you use throw a boomerang or something like that. He didn't design the Starship to look like a boomerang. Okay? It still comes back to Earth, but its first principles of the rocket equation, mass energy conversions, and so on. And he had to simulate it before he tried putting anything physical into outer space. Now, we've seen some of the results of experiments not being the same as the simulations. The last two Starships have exploded in flight rather than doing their half orbit of the planet. But you would never attempt to launch something as complicated as a rocket without simulating it first. Equally, you should not be trying to manage a national economy without simulating it first. So you need tools that enable you to do the simulation. Now, I don't know what software Musk is using in SpaceX for the simulations they do, obviously highly sophisticated engineering software. The only program that will do what I've shown here in terms of simulating a monetary economy is Ravel. And that's the program I've developed with Russell Standish. Check it out, see what you think, and then see if your analogies hold up in the modeling world. And please try that before you start doing it with a real economy.
If you're like many other truth seekers and want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks, you'll love my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. Go to stevekeen.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to stevekeen.com for the 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge. Good luck.